Good morning, everyone.
Good
We
morning.
would like to welcome our speakers, our invited participants, and I think some members of media also registered to cover our fifth day of Pilipinas Conference 2021. We had over 500 registrations. Hopefully, they can all participate in today's session that focuses on recovering Philippine democracy beyond the 2022 national elections. Allow me to share some of our thoughts that as we dealt with COVID last year, part of strat-based group that focuses on sectoral monitoring. We raised the issue as early as May 2020, the possibility of a COVID-19 corruption when we saw Bayanihan 1, Bayanihan 2, and the allocation of resources for COVID intervention. And then we already flagged it as one that's a key risk to Philippine democracy and the 2022 national election. Just last October, we wrote part of the team that wrote this brief on must corruption go on, which we shared both to our local and international networks, where we argued that in the coming elections and beyond, Filipinos must continue to hold their leaders accountable. And this is not simply the view of strat-based ADR Institute, but it's actually triggered by surveys, national surveys that we run across the country, across demographics, where we noticed that though the Philippines continues to deal with the economic consequences of this pandemic, just last October, it continues to take note of the issue of graft and corruption in government as a key issue that should be addressed by national leaders. And it's something close to my heart after 26 years of teaching governance, public administration in the university. This same question we're running again now nationally, so we can gauge it before the end of the year, working now with Pulse Asia. But last June, this is the same data that we saw. Graft and corruption still in top 3 before the issue of firemen. Even in Pulse Asia, though it went down a little to number 4, but still, after economic issue, the issue of graft and corruption seems to be very important to the Filipino people. And when you see all this news about family, about ratings or perception ratings, even internationally, you feel sad that so much suffering due to the economic consequence of this pandemic, but still so much misuse of resources. So in the next few slides, I simply wanted to share headlines that continue to affect me. So moving on, we wanted to also show that when you look at this question that we ran last October, imagine our people would like to look at candidate that will address their concern, given the sufferings of this pandemic, given the generation inequality. But second and third, they want an honest and trustworthy and even a not corrupt leader. This is not strat-based ADR Institute's views. This is the view of the Filipino people across geographic area. And we always emphasize across demographics, social classes, female, male, young, old. So we want to use this opportunity to discuss how do we deal with this challenge? How do we deal with this desire of the Filipino people? to allow us to share some of these views still. No? Consistent again, as of last June. Consistent again with Pulse Asia last June also. Imagine that. 5 months down the road, it's still the same concern. This is what the public wants. This is what is driving our democracy program in the ADRCG. We need to raise this issue. Tell our political leaders, this is what we're looking for. One that is not only pro-poor, but one that is not corrupt, one that is trustworthy and honest. But this is what we see in our headlines. And this is what we see also among our political leaders. When you look at the noise, the election noise. Just yesterday, I saw a coalition of political parties. I see an Estrada name. I see a Marcos name. I see Lakas for the Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo. I mean, what do I see? I see governments or administrations that did not practice good governance. That's why I've always argued that we need to counter threats to democracy. We must learn, and I'd like to emphasize, from the damaging lessons of these times and seize the opportunity to revitalize our nation from the deep scars of the present pandemic and governance crisis. But a sad reality beyond governance, one of the key challenges of the 2022 election is this pandemic of misinformation. We have seen it since 2016. We speak of false or wrong information that paralyzes people's critical ability to choose leaders. We need to collectively expose and denounce trolls and disinformation machineries. This is something that we are launching next month. Personally, I call it our version of disinformation resistance. We need to promote timely, factual, and right information. So last weekend, I felt compelled to write about it. But we have a moral duty to counter disinformation with an equivalent social army of dedicated democracy warriors. And that is what we have this morning. Different stakeholders, Philippine society, who I consider as democracy warriors. So again, as I open this 5th day of the Pilipinas Conference 2021, thank you for joining us. I would now like to introduce, for our opening remarks, a respected jurist, justice, and former ombudsman, Justice Conchita Carpe Morales, a champion of Philippine democracy and good governance. Ma'am.
To the organizer, Strat-based Albert Del Rosario Institute, thank you for having me again, this time to open this session. Good morning to my colleagues and to all those who have taken time in joining this forum. In the spirit of democracy, salamat sa patuloy na pag-alam at sa patuloy na pakikilahok. More than 3 decades since we stood our grounds and took back democracy, here we are again, contemplating on yet another recovery. I never imagined it to be this soon, because obviously still have those who have witnessed the atrocities in an authoritarian regime living to this day. They, and some of us here, along with verified accounts that immortalize the horrors of dictatorship, are expected to shepherd a country to always remember. Our education system has weaved in the dark ages of our history in the curriculum for present and future generations to learn and be reminded. And up until this day, those who learn and those who remember are labeled as those who cannot move on because of their constant barrage of reminders. Even in international democracy discourse, the Philippines has been cited numerous times as model for fighting off threats to democracy during our darkest times. Excuse me. In spite of and despite all of these, how can a country forget? Do we really not learn? Or those who did eventually learn failed at making us or the rest learn? Or is it because we haven't really made sense of the fruits of democracy or lack thereof? Hence, we are readily lured to subscribing to any other brand of governance. You know, that usual argument that ang tagal na natin, sa ganitong buhay, may nangyayari ba? To be fair, on the side of the defenders of democracy, the rampant purveyance of reversals of history and the rosy representation of a strongman type of rule that is well aided by social media platforms is a modern beast we should conquer. But that is also not to say we have not dealt with the same falsehood spreaders in the past who have, akin to the new age, who behave akin to the new age boots and trolls. It appears that we entered a new era of a convenience democracy, only using it when needed, such as in justifying our right to opinions, informed or otherwise, and our rights to about everything, including dissing, lying, and threatening, but dismissing the very essence of democracy in our ways and conduct. But this is not democracy's design. Democracy is not anything goes form of government. It is not tolerant of abuses in the guise of a right. And true enough, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution on the essential elements of democracy, viz. Separation and balance of power, independence of the judiciary, pluralistic system of political parties and organization, respect for the rule of law, accountability and transparency, free and independent media, and respect for human and political rights. Democracy may have variations, but these essential elements should be evident in a democracy. And as initial steps in restoring a corroding one, national introspection on how we are faring along these areas is a must. There is a need to check the current type of governance vis-a-vis these elements and understand why there is a threat. There is a need to sharply illustrate to the doubtful that the threat is not a figment of imagination, nor just an elitist sentiment that does not impact the general populace. We have to be clear that democracy cannot coexist with dictatorship or any tendencies thereof. There is no mixing and matching for the sake of convenience and absolution. We have to make the threat understood. We have to make it feared, and it is very urgent. If we are to look at how our democratic ideals of transparency, accountability, empowerment and participation and rule of law over the last years, can we say fairly that they have not heavily waned? In terms of transparency, for one, the asset declaration system, which has been so material in many investigations and lifestyle checks that zero in on potential illicit enrichment by government employees, seem to have been reduced to but paper compliance, a document readily available to public inspection for several years, which has marked stride in the transparency agenda, is now to a certain degree being held for incomprehensible rational. It is inconsistent with the provision of our laws and even with the executive branch's freedom of information. Can silence be weaponized for one? but hidden for another. Selective transparency is not a mark of democracy. As for accountability, surely there are present accountability mechanisms, such as the existing fora for airing complaints and grievances. But accountability is not limited to being able to determine who is at fault, but extends to the government's capacity to be answerable to the people and to provide solutions and to redeem itself after failure. In a crisis, for example, an accountable government is responsive and does not reduce its people to merely numbers or simply categorize them as victims of a government's wrong decisions. On another hand, democracy pushes for both participation and empowerment. Platforms to give voices to our people could not serve alone. Platforms have to be coupled with access to information. Our citizens and electorate may create meaningful participation if equipped with the information necessary for crafting and casting their decision. This benefits the country as informed citizenry is less blinded by rhetoric and empty pronouncements and engages in social concerns with informed decisions. This impacts on the country's welfare, especially when the decision of an informed electorate is translated into poll results. Rule of the law is the bedrock of democracy. In many parts of the world today, the rule of law is being disregarded and the law is being weaponized. Among us in this forum may be victims of legal aberration. Another cause of great concern are leaders who cannot figure out what is morally right and wrong. The monstrosity of supremacy and the trappings of power aptly explain why leaders transform themselves into autocrats or dictators. Let us be reminded that no matter how highly we regard ourselves, there is still a higher one, a higher order. There exists the overarching rule of law. The legitimacy of any law or jurisprudence would either sink or set sail depending on the strength of the sea of ethics upon which it relies for buoyancy and resilience. For us who should know better, we have professional and moral responsibility to sell democracy and its values, to bring the discourse in a level that would be appreciated by the nation, especially by the sectors which, by just trying to get by and bring food to the table, cannot anymore discern whether a democracy, an authoritarian rule, or another form of government could best serve their interest. We have to work more on documenting and communicating how some of the anti-poor and oppressive government-backed policies or actions are causing more harm than what we are made to believe as good. Let our values not be outshined by grand infrastructures that could be debt-ridden, nor by profound pronouncements and tough talks that could be empty, nor by swift solutions that could be irregular and low bending. In a democracy, we have the right to question, and we should dare question. We have been taught that government derives its power from the consent of the governed, and that advances committed against us are but results of our tolerance. If we're forgiving about all intimidations to our character as people and nation, whereby democracy plays a good part, then we can expect abusers to toy on our compassion and undermine our intellect as an electorate. And I think we have witnessed this by the turn of events in this election season. The rights of rights is an offspring of democracy if we turn our backs to the very principle that allows our voices to be heard and opt for leaders who have history of committing abuses and lies, then we can hardly speak of democracy beyond 2022. Our democracy is sick and it cannot stand another blow from a hand that has no regard for it. The coming elections are pivotal on so many points. The result would be a possible return to a regime with autocratic tendencies, could be a reinstallation to power of those who by history have already bastardized the democracy and milked the coffers of the country, or it could also be a restoration of good governance and democracy. Let the lessons of our history prompt us to use democratic values as litmus test for our future leaders. The 2022 elections may be a risky one, being in the midst of a pandemic, which has been a fertile ground for irregularities and corruption. But it's also a great opportunity to redeem ourselves by electing a set of leaders that would usher us to democracy and in the long term to recovery. May this season be fruitful at laying down, may this session rather, be fruitful at laying down great prospects and opportunities that are worth considering by our aspiring leaders. I hope that this would be proposed and discussed within the forum to go beyond recovery of our democracy, but sealing it for the benefit of future generations and for the deterrence of those who still want to challenge it. With that, I would like to formally open this forum. Maraming salamat at mabuhay tayo lahat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justice Conchita Carpio Morales. Always appreciative of your thoughts, your vision about how democracy and governance should prevail in our country. And you look, you have something nice in around your heart. Thank you, Bob. Allow me to introduce our moderator for this morning, Attorney Jenny Domino, a non-resident fellow of the Strat-based ADR Institute. But before I turn it over to her, I'd like to give a little background about our young colleague, Attorney Jen. She's a human rights lawyer, both locally and internationally. She did some work for a few years at Myanmar. And a law professor. She received her Master's of Laws degree at the Harvard Law School and a Juris Doctor degree from the University of the Philippines, where she was chair of the Philippine Law Journal. Attorney Jenny, I'll pass on the program to you. Please take care of moderating the rest of our session for today.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here and to moderate this event. Although I'm dialing in from Siargao Island, I'm really happy to take part in this conversation for today. Thank you so much for the opening remarks of our esteemed Justice, Justice Conchita Carpio Morales. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who will be giving our keynote address for today. He is none other than Commissioner Michael Aguinaldo, Chairperson of the Commission on Audit. Commissioner Michael Aguinaldo was appointed as Chairperson of the Commission on Audit, the Philippine Supreme Audit Institution, on March 24, 2015. He is a lawyer with extensive legal, governance, and administration expertise acquired from 25 years of professional work as private law practitioner, government official, and professor. Let's all welcome Commissioner Michael Aguinaldo.
Thank you, Jenny. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to deliver the keynote address for Strat-based ADR Institute's Pilipinas Conference 2021 with the theme, Recovering Philippine Democracy Beyond 2022. I must admit, I was a bit surprised to have been asked to deliver this address, as I was myself unsure what insights I could bring forth on the topic. So, like any person tasked to deliver a speech, one of the simplest things to do is to find suitable quotations that may be germane to the topic. So, through the magic of Google, I found quite a lot. One in particular caught my attention. This quote is attributed to an accomplished sociologist and scholar on political theory who also happened to be the former president of Brazil, Fernando Cardoso, who said, and I quote, "Democracy is not just a question of having a vote. It consists of strengthening each citizen's possibility and capacity to participate in the deliberations involved in life in society." Conventional wisdom looks at the right to vote as the cornerstone of democracy. When Abraham Lincoln said that democracy is the government of the people, by the people, for the people assumed he was referring to the representative democracy where people elect their representatives to act on their behalf. And so some assumed that that is where it ends. But if we go back earlier in time, Thomas Jefferson said that that government is the strongest of which every man feels himself a part. So if I may repeat, that government is the strongest of which every man feels himself a part. There is no doubt that voting for one's representative in government can engender that feeling on the part of a citizen. The idea of having a representative government is grounded on practicality. 100 million people cannot realistically govern themselves. Hence, they vote for candidates to represent them in government. But feeling oneself as part of government is not and cannot be limited to voting alone. There are various avenues where citizens can be made to feel that they are a part of government. Even our own constitution recognizes the right of the people and their organizations to effective and reasonable participation at all levels of social, political, and economic decision making. And there are laws that facilitate the establishment of adequate consultation mechanisms and encourage voluntarism. In the Commission on Audit, we have established almost a decade ago the Citizen Participatory Audit Program, where ordinary citizens and non-governmental organizations work side by side with our auditors, assisting them in the conduct of performance audits of government projects, from undertaking surveys on compliance with standards for barangay health centers or community awareness of solid waste management programs to actual measurement of farm-to-market roads by the farmer beneficiaries themselves. Ordinary folk and NGOs have seen firsthand specific government projects and programs, learned about the challenges and difficulties in implementation, and helped assess the effectiveness, efficiency, and at times the economy of these particular projects. This is by no means the only way that people can feel they are a part of government. From budgeting to community consultation, to opportunities in conservation work, disaster relief, teaching and mentoring, sports, and even animal care, there are areas where government can partner with people and NGOs, and in fact, they do partner with people and NGOs to achieve both social transformation and sustainable development. What's more is that, as the years pass by, we have more and more tools to make this participation easier. And so if I may ask for the slides to be shared, I just have a few slides. Yeah, thank you. Okay, just last Tuesday, the Commission launched the Project Reporting of Infrastructure Scheduling Monitor, or PRISM for short. Next slide, please. So what is PRISM? It's an application. It's an app that will be available on your mobile phone, but it's already available on the web, which is designed for monitoring, evaluating, and reporting different government infrastructure projects through different platforms, as I mentioned, mobile and web. Next slide, please. Now, the thought process behind PRISM is, the promotion of accountability and transparency through collection of audit infrastructure data for analytical reports and visualization. So just like a prism that we've studied in science back in school, PRISM signifies transparent elements that will refract data to produce spectacular and useful display of reports, an open data visualization platform for decision-making in public use. To give you a short background on this, about 8 years ago, one of our commissioners embarked on a project. There was a satellite office building of the commission that was being constructed in one province, and he decided to put up a Facebook page where pictures of that project as it's being constructed could be posted and people would be free to comment. Of course, the only ones who commented were people from the commission itself. But that gave us an idea with the technology that we have now, the ease by which we can take pictures, and the propensity of people to actually take pictures using their mobile phones or the cameras in their mobile phones, this really could be an avenue by which people could themselves monitor the actual construction or implementation of infrastructure projects in real time. And through connectivity, this is something that could reach even remote locations, or in the reverse, really, you could take a picture in a remote location and you'd be able to transmit it to basically everyone through that facility. Now, it took us a while to figure out how to do this. We had spoken with Facebook about it. We had spoken with Rappler about it. We've discussed this extensively with the World Bank. And unfortunately, maybe I don't know if it's lack of effort or what. We couldn't. There were always issues that hampered it, and by issues I mean a lot of them were technical issues. Ensuring that you don't get a lot of noise in the process. Ensuring that the amount of information could be managed effectively and it wouldn't be chaotic. I mean, if you have a Facebook page for each particular project, then you're looking at tens of thousands of Facebook pages. So that would not be sustainable, and it would clearly be unmanageable. Next slide, please. So our IT guys, and God bless them because they're really very talented and very good and have not yet been pirated. They actually won a competition in Indonesia called Hackathon, where they actually developed the prototype of this application. And these are some of the features. Okay, you can take pictures, and those pictures will be geotagged to a map that's built into the app. So you take the picture, and you can in fact upload it, and it will be accepted as long as the geotagging features or the metadata, which, well, for those not too familiar with the term, when you take a picture with your phone, it's by default connected to a satellite, and that satellite is able to triangulate, and not just triangulate, but specify the exact latitude and longitude of where that picture was taken. So it tells you where exactly the photographer was when he took that picture. And there is a database by which you can find nearby government projects. You have different map integration like you have in Google Maps. So in the screen, you can already see there's the 3D picture that's clear in front of you, but right behind it, you see a satellite image. No? And well, it's supposed to be a user-friendly interface and even the navigation. Next slide, please. Now, we also have the web portal, which is already online. You can browse projects by location. You can view, upload the geotag photos of those particular projects. Again, you also have different map integration and a user-friendly interface and navigation. So next slide, please. Okay, so of course, very concerned with privacy issues. So we use, or the app uses industry standard data collection practices and storage. So the data being collected is limited to device information, location and coordinates of device upon permission, of course, and the captured photo information. No personal identifiable information is being collected. Next slide, please. And so how does it actually work? So if you look there, you have the citizen on the left, and to his lower left, you do have there the Prism web portal. So he accesses the portal, he looks through it, and if you go process flow on the top or to his upper left, you have there the GAPAIS database. The GAPAIS is supposed to mean government projects, programs and activities information system. It's a database that is supposed to contain information on all government projects. So he'll now be able to look at different government projects, and if he's in a particular area, he can even find that using the map on the portal or even on the app. He can now take a photo, which is the next picture there, using the Prism mobile app, which will then automatically geotag the location of the person taking the photo. he can upload it now to the server, and the captured data will be uploaded to the Prism cloud server. It will, because there is metadata indicating the longitude and latitude, it would automatically, the system would automatically determine what project that picture refers to. So there is a mechanism there by using the location of where the picture was taken. And so that data goes two ways. One, it goes to the database for integration as part of the information on that project. So you will know that it's that project, and this picture refers to that project taken at this time at this location. At the same time, a notice or notification goes to the regional director, the assistant regional director, or the regional supervising auditor, and they immediately see the photo through email, basically. And they can now forward that to the audit team, who can update the information as well. And if there is an ongoing audit, they can take note of that as well. And then whatever information comes out of it, that goes now to our citizens' desk feedback mechanism, which is integrated with the PRISM system, so that the information can go back to the citizen. At the same time, the information can also be forwarded to the agency concerned or the specific office concerned for their appropriate action. So that's the process of how it's supposed to work. Next slide, please. Yeah. So thank you, because the beauty of this thing is now you have, or we have potentially a tool by which ordinary citizens can monitor infrastructure projects being done by government on real-time basis. They can participate now by showing what exactly is going on, what is the status, what does it look like at present. And anyone can do this. They just have to get on the PRISM app and be able to do. You can imagine, a student, on the way to school or coming home from school, passing by it, can actually just take a snap of that picture, might even do a selfie while doing it and upload it. A mother coming back from the market can take a picture of, a bridge being constructed in their area. And so you do have citizens, you do capacitate citizens to actually make a difference and to a certain extent take ownership over government projects that are being built in your area. Obviously, if a road or a bridge is being built in your area, you want to make sure it gets done, and obviously you want it done well. So this would be one mechanism by which this can be reported. And with the power of social media today, this news such as this can spread really fast. The beauty of this app is it's meant to eliminate noise. And by noise, I mean people posting pictures that have actually nothing to do with the particular project, and maybe not even then in that location. And so that way we also are able to avoid people who try to sabotage it by, posting a picture of, an unfinished road or so and claiming that, oh, this is the road built by DPWH in this area and it's nothing has been done, etc. But actually it was actually completed. So, you get to avoid that. And again, this is just an example of how government or how citizens can participate in government. Government cannot do it alone. People have to help. The key, therefore, to recovering democracy beyond 2022 is to provide ways by which the people can feel they are a part of government, apart from merely voting for representatives. This will give life to what, again, another quote, JFK said, ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. So thank you, and continue to stay safe, everyone.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Aguinaldo, for that inspiring speech and for emphasizing the importance of citizen participation in governance and providing us a very vivid example how that could look like through COA's PRISM app. Now, for our first panel for today, the first panel will talk about opportunities for citizen participation in the pandemic. So we'll dive deeper into this topic of citizen participation. Our first panel features experts from the academe and civil society to discuss different aspects of Philippine governance, especially in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. Our first speaker is Dr. Francisco Magno, who is the trustee and program convener of the Strat-based ADR Institute, and he's also a professor of political science at the De La Salle University. Dr. Francisco Magno is also the founding director of the De La Salle Institute of Governance and former director of the Social Development Research Center at DLSU. Please welcome Dr. Francisco Magno. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Attorney Jenny. So my presentation is on the opportunities for citizen participation in the pandemic. So I would like to locate my discussion within the framework of co-production, getting from the late Professor Elinor Ostrom. She said that far from being passive consumers, citizens and communities are important agents with the capacity to design and deliver services with improved outcomes. So citizens, stakeholders, non-government organizations, civil society organizations can actually be co-producers and not just consumers of public goods and services. Given that citizens on the ground may have more information, as shown by the presentation of Chairman Aguinaldo on the PRISM program. Elinor Ostrom also said that the penchant for neat, orderly, hierarchical systems need to be replaced with the recognition that complex, polycentric systems are needed to cope effectively with complex problems of modern life and to give all citizens a more effective role in the governance of democratic societies. So citizens are not just voters. In fact, they can be actively engaged in between elections, which is a whole lot of time. And citizens can actually monitor public programs. Professor John Gaventa of the Institute of Development Studies said that changing meanings of rights and citizenship, as well as the opening of new roles and spaces for citizen participation, raise critical questions about the ways in which civil society, state, and market actors hold each other to account. So participation is a mechanism, is a process for fostering transparency and accountability. So when we discuss participation, it has to be considered in the context of how it actually promotes transparency and accountability. The 1987 Philippine Constitution recognizes the crucial role of civil society organizations in governance and development. So let me cite several activities undertaken by non-government actors, civil society organizations, as co-producers in the context of pandemic governance. So I got this information from a report made by the Active Citizenship Foundation in partnership with the European Union. So this table provides us examples of civic engagement initiatives in the Philippines for the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, GoodGov PH did monitoring of local government agencies based on reports and complaints. So it's like doing oversight functions, but we call this social oversight or social accountability. Marine Conservation Philippines created a free simulator visualizing the impact of different forms of lockdown. So the importance of data analytics to guide planning and action programs. Help from home, documentation of different volunteer initiatives, and legitimate aid drives. The Kaya Natin movement organized a donation and fundraising campaign for personal protective equipment. and care food packs for health workers and frontliners, especially at the time when PPEs were in short supply. So we saw a lot of these activities from citizens providing medical tools and equipments, including, as I mentioned, PPEs, veggies for good, distribution of fresh produce to those who cannot leave their homes during the community quarantine. So it supplemented the ayuda provided by the government, the social amelioration programs. Leads for Health Security and Resilience Consortium. They conducted risk mapping and monitoring of capacities for resilience and vulnerabilities. We all know that data matters a lot in planning and in developing action programs. Government Watch did monitoring of citizen entitlements under the COVID-19 response, paying attention to providing what citizens are entitled to during COVID-19 crisis situation. So this is an action on budget monitoring and accountability. Think Well Philippines, match health workers to health facilities, again using data portals, data platforms, and Project Wi-Fi, provision of gadgets and load for students in need, especially at a time when schooling transition to from physical schools to schooling at home. So this is just a quick rundown on the types of citizen initiatives that were observed during the pandemic, and many more are being done as we speak. So let me cite some of these trends. It's very important to locate participation not only by looking at the demand side, but also at the supply side. I would always want to see good governance as a product of both supply and demand. So you need, in order to appreciate the good governance and democratic ecosystem, to look at both what government does and what the other side does, or the non-government side does, the stakeholders in the process. So the Ugnayan sa Pasig, citizen-centric initiative of the Pasig City amidst COVID-19 pandemic, has been recognized in the course Public Sector Productivity Specialist of the Development Academy of the Philippines. So the head of Ugnayan sa Pasig shared in the DAP program that transparency in cultivating an informed and involved public is crucial in implementing good governance and establishing the constituents' trust in its local government. So taking off from the local Freedom of Information Ordinance of Pasig City. Local governments can do or can legislate FOI ordinances. We do have an executive order on FOI, but for local government units, they legislate, as in the case of Pasig City. So as a product of that legislation, Ugnayan sa Pasig unit was established. It provides the public with an avenue for immediate assistance. So some form of they set up a citizens desk. Of course, all over the country, LGUs have citizen desks, but what's different here is that the Ugnayan sa Pasig unit is an established service unit of the city government. And it's also a mechanism for providing public data, information on the budget, on programs and projects, market operations, the status of various permits. And the Ugnayan unit also facilitates the accreditation of civil society organizations, NGOs, as active partners in local government policy formulation and program implementation. So I provided you this case of Ugnayan sa Pasig as a kind of good governance, as a best practice in this area. Look at the bigger picture. Ugnay sa Pasig provides a CSO desk all over the country as collated by the DILG. There are now 398 CSO desks in local government units, and there are 35 People's Council. So now the People's Council provide an avenue for providing a coalition of NGOs to participate in local deliberations, LGU deliberations. It's actually based on the local government code. In fact, there is a bill that has been passed already at the House level, a People's Council bill in every LGU. So this has been approved on final reading, and we await the bill's the deliberation from the Senate side. So this is welcome news because this just came out last January. And what are the provisions of the People's Council bill? Under the bill, the People's Council shall be composed of CSOs that will be accredited by the local sanggunian upon proof of submission of several requirements. Okay, so the People's Council may elect among themselves their representatives to all local government bodies, boards, councils, committees, task forces, special government bodies, and other similar work groups, which the local government or national laws may create. So this provides a very good platform for participation at the local level. People's Council may likewise participate in the conceptualization and evaluation of government activities, programs of the LGU, proposed legislation, and participate at the committee level of the local sanggunian. So another tool that has been developed by the DILG is the Citizen Satisfaction Index system. So it is a kind of a survey of the performance on service delivery of the LGU conducted by local resource institutes. Local resource institutes might be universities, or it can be NGOs in the area. So this is what is assessed. The different service areas LGUs are supposed to provide in the area of health, support to education, social welfare, governance and response, public works and infrastructure, environmental management, economic and investment promotion. So the citizens are asked whether they are aware of the service areas and the quality of provision of these services. And they are asked whether there is a need for action when it comes to the provision of these services. So it's similar to the surveys undertaken at the national level by Pulse Asia, social weather stations. But this one really considers the performance of local government units. But what is interesting is it's part of a cycle where the findings from the survey is actually discussed in focus group discussions with CSOs, in a utilization conference, how the survey results are actually addressed by the leaders. And in fact, all these reports are presented in the national summit. Now, let me go quickly on what have been achieved in terms of participation. We have to look at the participation, let's say, in the budget cycle, in public financial management, from budget preparation to budget approval, budget execution, and budget accountability. What Chairman Aguinaldo shared is a participatory audit, participation in budget accountability and budget monitoring. So let me just cite a number of practices that have been going on for several years. At the start of this presentation, I cited to you the more recent ones in the context of the pandemic, and especially because they are also very much linked to digital platforms, considering the context of the pandemic that we are in. So these are some examples in infrastructure monitoring. Of course, the iconic CCAGG, Concerned Citizens of Abra for Good Government, the group established by Manang Pura Sumangil. I had the privilege of working with her for a long time in the Transparency and Accountability Network. The prototype of a Bantay Lansangan really started with CCAGG when they started to monitor the road projects in the province of Abra. But what's nice nowadays is that it's not just physical monitoring, but we're actually using geotagging technologies and information technologies. So we have public expenditure tracking and procurement monitoring, infrastructure monitoring, not only applied to roads and bridges, but also to the construction of schools, participation in budget formulation, and procurement monitoring. An example of this is textbook count. So one of the early practitioners of the People's Council is the Naga City People's Council. As I mentioned, there are now several models of People's Council. We have in Quezon City and Cagayan de Oro City and a host of other cities. So you have medicine monitoring projects undertaken by NAMFREL and other groups, participatory planning by the Barangay Bayan Consortium a number of years ago, and the Palawan Advocates for Good Governance doing participatory planning and engaging in barangay development planning. So I will now summarize my presentation by just presenting to you again, going back to the notion that there is a supply side and there is a demand side when we speak of public participation. So the supply side would be the enabling conditions. So this would include political culture and democratic space, enabling policies and programs. So as I was listening to Chairman Aguinaldo, I typed in, I revised this presentation and put in PRISM. Of course, we have the local government code. There are opportunities for revising the local government code and incorporating participatory practices. We have a recent Safe Spaces Act that considers importance of making public consultations more safe and inclusive, the role of open data, citizens' access to reliable public documents and data. We have the transparency seal in national agencies and the full disclosure policy. That's included in the local government code. The right to information, FOI, I mentioned a while ago, the local FOI in Pasig City, budget support for open data infrastructure and capacity building for government agencies on public participation. Having said that, we have to consider the latest data from the worldwide governance indicators on the Philippine performance on voice and accountability. This is the area in the WGI where the Philippines perform relatively well in the ASEAN region, placing second to Indonesia. But let's consider the trend. The percentile ranking of the Philippines has been declining over the years in voice and accountability, because the measure of voice and accountability includes freedom of expression, rule of law, and other indicators. And lastly, enabling conditions on the demand side for participation. We have to look at the availability and accessibility of independent media. As I mentioned, participation operates in an ecosystem where independent media is very important. Capacity, legitimacy, representativeness, responsiveness, and accountability of civil society actors. The role of data, information intermediaries, and policy think tanks. So we have data, but data doesn't speak on its own. We need people to interpret the data, and this would be a very important value proposition for citizens. So this would aid our citizens in making good judgments. Provision of data analytics, infographics, and policy reports. And finally, public participation in policy oversight mechanisms. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Magno, for explaining to us citizenship participation through the co-production lens. That citizens are more than just voters, but they can have continuing roles to play in governance beyond elections. And one way of facilitating this, as you expertly highlighted, is through the passage of FOI ordinances at the LGU level, because citizens can't be active partners in governance without the information necessary to participate. Our next panelist will explore reform options for reducing inequality in the Philippines. Dr. Ronald Mendoza is the current Dean of the Ateneo School of Government and the former Executive Director of the Asian Institute of Management Policy Center. His background is in international development policy and international development cooperation. And I just like to, for the information of our audience today, I just like to share that each panelist will have 10 minutes to present their lecture. Dr. Ronald Mendoza, the floor is yours.
Thanks for the chance to share with you some ideas on this topic today. Why is our country in deep trouble, and what can we do about it? In what I will share next, I will draw heavily on a lecture that I gave late last year in 2020, focusing on inequality, dynasty, and oligarchy. So in a nutshell, I wanted to share some thoughts on the nature of inequality in our country. So in a word, my answer to that question of why we are in such deep trouble right now has to do with the different forms of inequality that are affecting our politics, our economics, and our society. So this is just a well-known figure on the inequality in opportunity, inequality in incomes, and the weak upward mobility that we have, that we seem to have as a country, combined with the vulnerability to shocks of some of our population. So here's the income pyramid for the Philippines. The poor households comprise 4.2 million. The low income households around 7.1 million. The middle income class households about 9.8. And finally, on top is about 320,000 households. So these are estimates based on the official statistics of government. And what they basically show us is a really imbalanced income distribution for the country. And it reflects the high Gini coefficient, the indicator of inequality, income inequality in the Philippines. And the headline here is, as of 2012, over 11.3 million Filipino households, around half of total, are classified as low income class or poor. And these households, including many in the middle income class, are actually quite vulnerable to shocks. So they can get knocked down from time to time. And I think the general observation with many studies is that there is weak upward mobility within the Philippines. So we are reducing poverty very, very slowly. We are emancipating some of our fellow Filipinos from poverty and destitution. But there is a very, very big group of Filipinos stuck in the base of the pyramid. Even as they are not poor, their aspirations for upward mobility are still not met by our society and economy. And the best way for many of them to meet those aspirations is actually to migrate or to work abroad. So this is the imbalance in opportunity that characterizes the high degree of inequality that we face in our economy. The second point I wanted to make is the inequality in politics. So that is best reflected in the concentration of political power that we see in the political dynasties. So this political inequality is something I've been doing research on for the past decade. And it seems that this inequality in power is very much linked to the inequality in wealth, which we just saw. Except it's pretty much characterized by this figure where while the leaders are in power, they can actually increase their wealth dramatically. So it's not necessarily clear whether they are pushing the common good while they are in power, or is it more of a personal family gain that seems to be the overriding concern for some of these leaders. And I'll just give you an example here. Thought-provoking example, I hope, is these two senators, one served from 2009 to 2012, increased her net wealth from 0.95, sorry, his net wealth from 0.95 to 1.45 billion. And then another senator that served in 2013 to 2019 increased net wealth from 1.63 to 3.53 billion. And I guess the punchline I just wanted to share here is not just that these are dramatic increases in net wealth while you are in power, while you are a senator. The other punchline is that these two senators are actually husband and wife. They're married to each other and actually belong to one of the most powerful political clans in the country. So again, this sort of signals and in fact mirrors the inequality in the economy and a big group of Filipinos whose aspirations are not necessarily met by the economy, and a big inequality in the political system where those pretty much those same Filipinos' voice is not as strong because the concentration of political power is in favor of political dynasties. So I believe the economic inequality and the political inequality are very much tied to each other, favoring a wealthy political class and not in favor of you know the vast majority of our poor and low income Filipinos. The third point I wanted to make is a third type of inequality, a third story in terms of Philippine inequality. And that is that even the non-political entrepreneur class in the Philippines, those engaged in business, the wealthiest of them are actually investing and conducting most of their business in areas that tend to be rent rich and are not necessarily known for dramatic job creation prospects. So the structure of the economy itself in terms of where the wealthy and the big corporations are investing does not seem to be conducive to the meeting of the aspirations of many Filipinos who aspire for more and better jobs. So this is just a figure that we've been collecting in terms of the 10 richest Filipinos. So that the top 10 billionaires in the Philippines. So that's the columns that you will see here in this figure, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 until 10. And the dots are where these wealthy Filipinos are actually conducting business or engaged in business. And the red area is actually that those sectors in the literature identified as very rent rich, rent being those types of activities that don't necessarily grow the economy but are very much engaged in redistributing wealth. And rent seeking is seen in the economics literature as one of those activities that don't necessarily improve competitiveness nor increase growth necessarily, and they are actually in many ways counterproductive and prone to corruption. The areas which tend to be more competitive, where innovation is more likely, where competition is healthier, these are areas where some of the wealthy invest. But clearly, if you will look at this graph, the concentration of activities are in banking and casinos, and in power and real estate. And these are areas that are not necessarily known for job creation, and pretty much describes the inability of our largest firms and wealthiest to break into export markets, improve our manufacturing, and create what many expected and argued as the third leg needed for our economy to grow and to produce inclusive growth. The first two legs being remittances and domestic services. So here's my full answer to that question of what ails us, and I just gave you a discussion of the three main inequalities that I feel, that I sense is part of the full answer, and it will be reflected in this framework that I will propose. So first of all, elections are dominated by political dynasties and there are weak political parties. We see that right now. Um, they don't necessarily lead to strong reform agendas. In fact, they tend to weaken and make more uncertain the reform agenda. This leads to, or at least opens the door for continuous state capture and rent seeking, to the extent that there is no strong institutional pushback against those types of behaviors. Then you have a healthy degree of corruption finance. Thanks to the rent seeking behavior, there are many uh, corrupt politicians who are able to amass war chests, which they can then um, use to further their personality type politics, their traditional politics, and also continue to engage in the political system in a very dominant way. And finally, all of this leads to an environment of weaker governance, weaker institutions, more uncertain reform agendas, and definitely they ultimately link up to a slower poverty reduction environment and the continued vulnerability of the middle class, the newly emancipated poor, who are not necessarily going to be benefiting from strong upward mobility. They get stuck in that base of the pyramid because it's still a highly unequal society. And if you have that as the basis for conducting elections, many uncertain, weak, and dependent um, voters who are vulnerable to intimidation, vulnerable to vote buying, and may not necessarily see themselves, their agency strengthened, then you have the conditions for the continued dominance of political clans, which then brings us back to this part. So here are the three main types of inequality that I just shared earlier, and they are seemingly linked into this narrative, circular narrative that reinforces each other. So political concentration of power leads to economic concentration because it doesn't really change the status quo. In fact, the politicians tend to benefit from the status quo. That economic concentration then leads to an inequality in opportunities and a vulnerability to getting knocked down the income ladder again and again. And that therefore characterizes the weak upward mobility in the country, which then again feeds into the concentration of political power because the political class will just take advantage of that. So that in a nutshell is my interpretation of what ails us. Now to add an additional idea, which is what might we be able to do in order to address this. Um, a simple framework which I and my colleagues in Ateneo Policy Center have been thinking about is comprised of building a more inclusive society, building a more inclusive democracy, and building a more inclusive economy. So inclusion is the way to break free from the inequality trap. What specifically does this entail? Well, several key elements include stronger social protection, for instance, during crises and shocks. So you don't get knocked down. If you got out of poverty, the chances of you being non-poor and continuing your way upwards should be strong. Uh, building the prospects for strong upward social mobility, which can only occur in a society that builds more opportunities at home rather than abroad, or relying on opportunities abroad. An inclusive democracy must include a regulation of dynasties, just as we have the regulation of competition on the economic side. We need to begin to regulate the competition on the political side to ensure that our elections are still a healthy competition and the political system is not dominated by just a few political clans. Strengthening political parties will also help because that's where the alternative leaders may be coming from. And the final thought is in terms of the inclusive economy, and this is rather well known, improve the competition in the economy, such as opening up certain sectors that have been heavily regulated and protected, as well as strengthening innovations like the political competition, Philippines Competition Authority, which is a good innovation and a reform that is worth supporting moving forward. And then, of course, efforts to level the playing field in the economic space by eroding economic concentration and improving the prospects for new players who will bring in innovation and stronger competition in the Philippine landscape. Thank you for the chance to share these ideas, and I look forward to our discussion.
Alamin kung ano ang mga kasalukuyang
Thank you for that presentation, Dr. Mendoza, and for highlighting the widespread inequality in the Philippines. Often when we think about inequality, we think of economic inequality, but political inequality has a significant impact, as you rightly presented, on the upward mobility of ordinary Filipinos. Our last panelist for the first panel is Ms. Ziza, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Ms. Ziza Nadine Suzara, and she will talk about national budget as public investment. Ms. Suzara is currently the Executive Director of the Institute for Leadership, Empowerment and Democracy, or ILEAD. Her career has focused on public policy, governance and development, working with USAID and the Department of Budget and Management, among others. The floor is yours, Ms. Suzara.
Thank you, Attorney Jenny, for the introduction. It's actually Ziza. Before I start my presentation, I just want to greet everyone good morning, and thank you again to Strat-Based Institute for inviting ILEAD to present our analysis of the national budget. So this is actually my second time participating in the Pilipinas conference. I will be sharing some slides. I normally do a budget discussion for at least 45 minutes. So it's really a challenge to do this in 10 minutes. So I will probably go a bit over time, but to start off, allow me to share my screen. So as I was thinking about what to focus on and how to frame this discussion on the budget, since I was asked to talk about the national budget as public investment, I thought of framing this discussion in terms of trade-offs in the 2022 proposed budget. Why the 2022 proposed budget? Of course, because this is the budget that's currently being deliberated on in Congress. We're expecting it to be legislated before the year ends, and this will be essentially the budget that we will have next year. This is supposed to be our economic recovery budget, so it's worth knowing what's actually been proposed by the executive branch, how the Senate has reviewed and added certain provisions in that proposed budget of the executive branch. So my presentation today will basically begin by situating the national budget, and I'm really very glad and I appreciate the discussions made by Dr. Magno and Dean Ron Mendoza earlier. It really provides a lot of context for what I wanted to talk about. So after discussing that, I will then talk about the trade-offs in the 2022 proposed budget. So the main question that we want to answer is this budget designed for recovery? And better yet, is this a budget designed for inclusive recovery? And then I will end with some recommendations. So first, let me situate the national budget in terms of politics, governance, and economics. I think what we have to remember about the national budget particularly the budget process, is that it is one of the central institutions of the state. And because it is a central and an important process in policy making, in governance, in legislation, it is an inherently political process. So public budgeting in that sense is therefore an arena of competition for limited resources. And especially here in the Philippines, we've been affected by the pandemic. We've faced unprecedented economic crisis, the worst since World War II, in fact. Therefore, it's important to look at the national budget and think about it this way. The budget is really, in principle, the clearest expression of any government's development agenda. So you can think of it as basically the financial blueprint for economic growth. Or in this case, in this context, it should be the financial blueprint for economic recovery. And all budgets contain trade-offs because budgets, financial, fiscal resources are limited. And what that involves is a variety of actors with different spending goals. And the necessity of choice leads to competition between actors, among programs, and even among beneficiaries. So another question that I'd like to pose as you listen to this discussion is, whose interest does the 2022 proposed budget serve? So fiscal policy, in the context of the current economic and socio-economic crisis that we're facing, fiscal policy is the key to recovery, and the budget is very central to that. Economists around the world, there's wide consensus among these economists that there should be no trade-off between public health and the economy. So earlier I said the budget contains trade-offs. But if you think of economic recovery, we should not think of trade-offs between public health and the economy. And in the midst of great economic misery, economists around the world, including the IMF, said that government must not scrimp on aid. Therefore, I go into this discussion wanting to emphasize that the national budget is actually the most potent tool to save lives and livelihoods. So how much is the 2022 proposed budget? It's 5 trillion pesos. That's about 11.5% higher than the current budget that we have now in 2021, which is 4.5 trillion pesos. And we go straight to the trade-offs. Let's look at the budgets for health. Basically, when we looked at the numbers, what we found out is that the budget, the 2022 budget as designed by the executive branch, is ill-equipped to contain the pandemic. Sure, there was an increase in the budget of the DOH, but public investments to boost the public health system is necessary. However, the budget does not adequately support a more robust pandemic response. And this is based on our analysis of figures in the budget. For one, the funds for booster shots are again parked in the unprogrammed appropriations. The unprogrammed appropriations is basically like an unfunded check. DBM cannot release the funds to the government agencies unless these three conditions are met. First, if there are excess revenue collections from new tax measures. Second, if there are new revenues collected from new tax or non-tax sources. And third, if there are approved foreign assistance projects. Now, the economic manager said this really isn't a problem because the vaccines will be funded anyway by loans from donors and from foreign governments. But there is a valid question that we can raise with respect to parking the funds for booster shots in the unprogrammed appropriations, because the government is targeting to collect 3.3 trillion pesos worth of revenue. If we have 3.3, if the government is expecting to collect 3.3 trillion pesos in revenues, why does it need to get a loan to fund only 45 billion pesos worth of funds for the booster shots? The other things that we saw in the budget is that when it was designed and when it was submitted by the executive branch to Congress, there was no allocation for contact tracing, either in the budget of the DOH or the DILG. There were also no funds to expand testing, no funds for allowances of health workers, and the budgets for specialty hospitals like NKTI, the Heart Center, the Lung Center were actually slashed. We go now to addressing economic misery. The pandemic is not a blip. And we've been saying this, my colleagues in ILEAD have been saying this since last year. The pandemic will leave deep economic scars in our country. But despite record high economic misery, the government continues to scrimp on aid. There was nothing provided anymore after Bayanihan 1 and Bayanihan 3. And the proposed budget, similar to the 2022 national budget, is still not designed for the welfare of ordinary Filipinos and the survival of small businesses. Some of our key observations are as follows. In the DSWD budget, there's no new budget item for massive cash transfer program, even if Bayanihan 3 was never passed. And Bayanihan 3 was not passed because the DOF said there were no more revenues to finance that measure. But people are hungry. People have lost jobs. For peace families and perhaps many other families have probably slid down the poverty line because of the protracted crisis that we're facing. There were also less funds for individuals and families in difficult circumstances, and there was little to no movement for programs targeting vulnerable groups. Now, for labor and employment, there were only marginal increases in labor assistance programs despite the persistence of unemployment and underemployment. Unemployment went down to about 3 million in July, but it went up again to around 4 million by the end of September. And there are no funds for jobs guarantee or wage subsidies or even retooling of skilled workers. When we look at the Department of Trade Industry, we know that we know the context here. A lot of micro, small, and medium enterprises closed down, and by close and permanently closed down, not just temporarily closed down. So simply reopening the economy will not work for these micro, small, and medium enterprises. But what we saw in the budget of DTI is that there were actually cuts as well in several key programs, despite the harsh impact of the global pandemic on many local industries. There was only a 1 billion peso increase for MSME development despite widespread business closures. There was no additional subsidy for stimulus programs for MSMEs, which could have been channeled to the Small Business Corporation. That is partly because the Small Business Corporation wasn't able to disburse all of the funds that were provided to them under Bayanihan 2. And then for the DOT, the budget cuts, and there was basically stagnation in budget cuts everywhere else in the budget of the DOT. And if you look at their budget, it seems that there's really no clear direction for the recovery of the tourism industry, even if it's one of the industries that heavily suffered because of the pandemic. And there's also no clear strategy, at least based on the budget of the DOT, to assist tourism workers who lost jobs. And when you look at DepEd, it's basically still inadequate to support distance learning. It's ill-prepared for the reopening of classes. The Philippines is, as you know, one of only a few countries in the world that has not reopened classes until now. What's planned is basically a pilot testing for the reopening of schools. And the budget as well of DepEd is not designed to address dropout rates among students, despite claims that the administration will invest massively on the youth. And of course, the quality of these allocations will impact on the country's human capital development. So if funds did not go to boosting the pandemic response and providing aid to Filipinos who were affected by the pandemic, where did it go? Basically, build is touted as the vehicle towards economic recovery. And so infrastructure continues to dominate the fiscal space. That's about 1/5 of the total proposed national budget at 1 trillion pesos. But there is a problem here. the spending performance of DOTH and DOTR has not been stellar, and the quality of allocations are also questionable. The slide that I'm showing here is based on data of the Department of Budget and Management. Basically, what you see here, we focus on the pink line, which is the disbursement rates or the actual payments made by DOTR to contractors and what's counted in the GDP. We see that the spending performance of DOH in terms of their disbursement has actually worsened since 2017. So what are they basically paying? They're paying for previous years' projects that were obligated in previous years as well. And when you look at DOTR, we see the same spending performance. In fact, these observations that I'm talking about right now have been pointed out as well by the Commission on Audit in their reports in 2017, 2018, and 2019. And the corporate reports were actually stating, and they said that DOTR and DPWH basically did not basically failed to meet their mandates because of these low disbursement rates. With respect to the quality of allocations in the budget of DPWH, a lot of questions can also be raised here, and this ties very much with Professor Ron Mendoza's discussion a while ago about political dynasties and rent-seeking behavior of these dynasties. The total budget of the DPWH for 2022 is 695 billion pesos. If you look at the major programs of the DPWH, you will see that there was a sharp decrease in the local program. That is because of the implementation of the Mandanas ruling. And part of that implementation, as mandated in the EO issued by Malacanang, is the implementation of full devolution, among which is the implementation of local infrastructure projects. But you'll be surprised to see that the convergence program sharply increased by 232%. So that's from only 62 billion pesos in this year's budget. It went up to 207 billion pesos in the proposed budget for next year. Why is that? What did we find there? Basically, it's just rebranded pork for the 2022 elections. Most of the types of projects that used to be in the local infrastructure program were traditionally the line item budgets initiated by legislators for their own districts are lodged, have been transferred to the convergence and special support program of the DPWH. And it was called by a different name. One cluster of projects is called Sustainable Infrastructure Projects Alleviating Gaps. The second is Basic Infrastructure Program. And why is this questionable? It's because of the huge, not just the sheer amount, not just the 124 billion peso fund that's included there in the budget of the DPWH. It's also because this allocation kind of duplicates what's already mandated in the Mandanas ruling. So if the national government is saying that it took out local infrastructure projects from the budget of DPWH because it's going to implement the Mandanas ruling, then why do we see the same types of projects under a different program of the DPWH? Another trade-off that we saw in the budget is that there's the presence of non-urgent expenditure items. And by non-urgent, I'd like to qualify this as expenditure items that do not directly respond to the COVID-19 pandemic and the socio-economic impact it has. And those items still eat up the fiscal space. Remember that we're operating in a budget that's very limited to begin with to address the health crisis and more so the socio-economic misery that Filipinos are facing. So again, the billions of funds for anti-insurgency, which we've been hearing about last year. So from only 16.4 billion pesos this year, that went up to 28 billion pesos in the 2022 budget. And again, there's the financial assistance to local government units, another 13 billion for that. despite, again, the implementation of the Mandanas ruling. And then apart from the NTF LCAP budget, there's 2 billion pesos more tucked in the budgets of different agencies. 1 billion of that 2 billion is in the budget of the PNP. And there are as well smaller items in the budgets of DILG for these types of projects. And that further skews the budget prioritization away from pandemic response and providing aid for Filipinos. And then there's still an avalanche of funds at the president's disposal. So that's of course the contingent, that's of course the confidential funds and the intelligence funds lodged in the budget of the Office of the President, which, as you can see here, grew from 250 million pesos only when President Duterte assumed office, and it's now at 2.22 billion pesos each. And then there's also the contingent fund. It's not very clear how exactly the contingent fund has been used during the pandemic, but yeah, it was kept at 13 billion pesos. But there are some positive developments. I know those are not very good good information to find out about our national budget. The Senate tried to correct those trade-offs in the executive proposed version of the 2022 budget. So at least in the Senate version, in the committee report on the general appropriations bill, there was a 45 billion peso increase in the budget for COVID-19 health-related expenditures. So can just read them. So at least those things that were not initially funded already had certain allocations for them. And there was almost a 1 billion peso increase in the different specialty hospitals. But that essentially just kept the subsidy level to the same level as it is in the 2021 General Appropriations Act. And for the payments of the benefits of health frontliners, the Senate also filed a separate bill to be able to compensate them. But the question remains, what will be the source of financing for this proposal? So even if there's a bill, even if assuming it will be passed, where will the executive branch source the revenues for this? There were also significant amounts slashed by the Senate from infrastructure projects. It's not as high as the 124 billion, which the People's Budget Coalition that I lead, Citizens Budget Tracker, and Makati Business Club convened. But at least there was a 32 billion peso budget slashed from the DPWH, 2 billion slashed from DOTR. The 24 billion of the 28 billion from the NTF LCAP fund was also slashed, so there's only 4 billion pesos left there, at least in the Senate version. And around 23.5 billion was also slashed from special purpose funds like the contingent fund, the miscellaneous and personnel benefits fund, the pension and gratuity fund. And those budgets that were slashed from these four items were basically reallocated to the budgets of DOH, DSWD, DOLE, DTI-SUCs, which as I presented earlier, were severely inadequate to respond to the pandemic. So there's at least funds for standby ayuda in case there are future lockdowns. Also a bit more funds for social protection programs, also some funds for emergency livelihood and employment. But just to conclude this discussion, it's important for us to know that without solving the public health crisis first, the country's economic recovery will also be derailed. And that's very much contingent on governance. Governance is very critical to get us out of this situation we're in. So budget cuts are really not the only problem. It's the absorptive capacity of government agencies and how our leaders are actually able to marshal those agencies and lead them to implement projects faster that would address the pandemic. And the strategy for economic recovery and how that is reflected in the national budget must therefore be an election issue. Professor Guindo Manhit mentioned a while ago that economic misery is a top issue among Filipinos aside from corruption. So it's very much valid to ask whose interest does the national budget favor if Professor Ron Mendoza's presentation a while ago showed that pyramid where a lot of people remain in the Philippines remain poor, then we should demand for a budget that actually addresses the plight of the poor, especially in the middle of an unprecedented crisis like this global pandemic. And so I'll end by putting forward some recommendations. One is what we can do right now, and also more long-term broad recommendations around the budget and governance as well. So definitely there is a need to recast the 2022 proposed budget towards an inclusive recovery. And this was an exercise done by the People's Budget Coalition. We basically engaged the budget process, talked to the Committee on Finance as well as other senators. We presented our proposal based on consultations from multi-sectoral groups, from health, coalitions, the 4Ps families, teachers and students, transport workers, and many other groups who participated in the budget process, the alternative budget process that we launched a couple of months ago. And the priorities that emerged are these. There should be funding to boost the healthcare system. There should be support for workers and small businesses. There should be aid and social protection, not only during lockdowns, but also to help people recover from the financial impact of the pandemic to them. There should also be safe and humane public transportation in the new normal. And for the broader and more long-term reforms that need to be considered around the budget, the succeeding national expenditure programs must factor in the uncertainties of the pandemic on the path to inclusive economic recovery. And structural reforms would certainly need to be implemented to improve efficiency and the quality of government spending, because a lot of these things depend on the ability of government to actually use the resources that are allocated to them. There should also be open and participatory mechanisms to re-establish transparency and accountability in the use of COVID-19 funds, considering the lack of information on how the COVID-19 funds that have been authorized by Congress under Bayanihan 1 and Bayanihan 2 have actually been used. I end my presentation here and will be glad to respond to any questions if there are any during our Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you for that very detailed presentation, Zaiza, and for giving us rich insights with which to assess our 2022 national budget. For the information of the audience, contrary to what I said a while ago, Ms. Suzara is actually not our last speaker for this panel. Our last panelist is Dr. Lenny Hara, who will discuss a genuine people's health agenda beyond health measures. Dr. Lenny Hara is the Executive Director for the Council for Health and Development and one of the conveners of Shape Up Defeat COVID-19. She is one of the strongest advocates of evidence-based and people-centric pandemic responses. The floor is yours, Dr. Hara.
Yes, thank you, Attorney. May I ask for screen share? Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. This is about what do we really need as a people beyond health measures towards a genuine people's health agenda. Can we go on, please? As you know, the current Philippine healthcare system and the health situation is really not in a very good shape. Even before the pandemic in 2019, there was an increasing burden of health about out of about 41% of those who died were not attended to by any public health officials, doctors, or nurses, and most of them, almost half, died in their own homes. And then this one, the current health expenditure by the healthcare financing scheme, we can see that most of our expenditures would be out of pocket. It is 47.9% out of pocket. So this is actually being labeled by the World Health Organization as a catastrophic health spending. So kalakahan yan gagaling sa ating bulsa. And we just heard about how little or how small the budget is allocated for health. This will show this. For example, we don't have to go through all these numbers. It's just that libre nga ba ang testing para sa COVID-19? We know that we have been asking since the start of the pandemic that there should be free mass testing, aggressive contact tracing. As we have heard, no budget was really allotted for this, so it was never free until now. So in public facilities, it will amount to 3,800. Even if you have your PhilHealth, you still have to pay from out of your pocket more than 300 pesos. So they compare it with the minimum wage. It's about, you are actually spending 107% of the minimum wage that you're receiving. So it's really, the poor becomes poorer and they are not able to get all this testing even in the community level, unless they become sick and they have symptoms. So we have been under-tested all these times. So with regards to the health workforce, it's supposed to have, as we heard from our last speaker, the budget really for health is really low. And we know that for the past 2 years, our health workers at the front line have been asking for increase in their salaries, especially in private hospitals, but likewise, many are contractual and they don't receive the amount that they're supposed to receive and even the benefits that's in the law already, the special risk allowance, all those MAT that they call the meals, accommodation, transportation allowance. So most of our health workers really, even during the time of the pandemic, they would be leaving the country because we cannot blame them. We do not blame them because they have really to survive and their families have to survive. Now, can you see this? Although it is quite small, this is the ratio of doctors and nurses and midwives, dentists, medical technologists, nutritionists to our population. The one at the end most will be the ideal. One doctor is to 1,000 population. Nurses would be one nurse to 500 population, and so on and so forth. You can see it. And in 2020, we have one doctor to 32,000 population, one nurse to 5,000 population, and if you see, for example, the nutritionist, this one, if you need 51 nutritionists for 50,000, there is only one nutritionist for 177,000. And for medical technologists and dentists also, the ratio is really, there's really a lack of health personnel. So there is a shrinking government role in health. And even during the pandemic, as was mentioned, there was a special bayanihan, but no, not everybody, that budget was not used 100%, because many of the health workers said, even after our dialogue with the Secretary Duque, that they were not all given the benefits that were due them for this period. So as you can see, our hospitals would be 67% private hospitals and 33% would be public hospitals. So that is the kind of situation that we are in. And in our communities, if we have more than 40,000 barangays, there are only 22 or half of the barangays that will have barangay health stations. And remember, even before, there was a lot of corruption in the building of these barangay health stations. So up to now, it's 50% of our total barangays do not have these barangay health stations. And for example, a lot of the budget for health is being given to PhilHealth. We do not know what happened to the 15 billion worth of funds that was pocketed, and we do not know whether those officials who resigned or were made to resign actually paid for it, or were even, or had lawsuits. We don't know. We have not heard of anything. So there is actually really also corruption in our PhilHealth. Okay, please. So what do we have to do? We have actually, probably we can go on with this because these are just, as we know, health is a constitutional right. We have to remove unjust socioeconomic structures in health. This is all in the papers, and it should be people-centered, and there should be a redistribution of wealth and equitable access to health, and we should be self-reliant and responsive to the needs of the people. However, these are not all happening. As we can see from the workforce, the health workforce, from the structures that we need, and also the kind of response that we have during the pandemic. We know that sabi namin, dapat lapat. What is lapat? Dapat yung testing, yung contact tracing, yung bakuna, yung ayuda sa mga mahihirap, at yung tuloy-tuloy na pagtulong natin sa ating mga kababayan. It never happened. It really never happened. Actually, it's among the people who are helping each other. And I agree with our previous speakers that many of the non-government organizations were active during this pandemic. Next, please. So we have proposed actually a people's health agenda, a people-centered national healthcare system that is free, comprehensive, and progressive public healthcare system. We used to have this even in hospitals, in government hospitals in the 1970s. Patients would go there and there will be no, they will not be asked to pay. There was no insurance. The hospital, like in UPPGH, would provide, and other government hospitals would provide the medicines, the laboratory examinations, and all the things that they would need to be able to be treated in a public hospital. And that was in the late 70s. But as of now, right now, we know that the budget for hospitals has been going down, as was mentioned earlier. So we also want equity in health resources. We do community-based approach, and we should focus on prevention. And we have to do health education among our people in our communities. And also, of course, we are one with the medical frontliners now that there should be more, they should be given what is due them, and there should be an increase in their salaries, and then there should not be contractualization, and there should be security of tenure. And another of the people's health agenda that we would like to have is a genuine pharmaceutical industry. Also these years, actually ang gagaling natin mga Pilipino, ang dami natin mga researchers, ang dami nating scientists. We can do this if the government actually helps out. We can do this. We have researchers. We are one of the countries with the more of these medicinal plants, and we have had studies on this. So we can, if other countries can do this, we can do this with the help of the government, with funding. Ang laki ng potential natin dito, at hindi mahihirapan ang ating mga kababayan. And beyond health measures, of course, we have to think of the social, political, and economic determinants of health. Mas marami sa ating mahihirap. So kailangan natin talaga silang matulungan. and yung mga kailangan ng gawin ng pamahalaan para matulungan ang mga tao ay dapat ngayon na kailangan na. So with that, we know that we have to continue fighting for our right to health. Next slide, please. And we continue to demand from the government to increase the health budget, and we want free medicines for the people, and the increased health budget for free services for the poor citizenry. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that rich presentation on a people-centric response to the pandemic, Dr. Hara. At this point, we now open the floor to questions. For the information of the audience, you can leave your questions on the Q&A box here on Zoom, but I believe we're over time, so we will only be picking one question. Okay, so we do have two questions now here. Perhaps we can continue this question and answer after the second panel. So I will take the question from Mr. Ernesto Pernia. How will the highly pronounced wealth and income inequality across households affect the upcoming elections? Anybody from the panel would like to take on this question? Perhaps, I'm not sure if Dr. Mendoza is still here with us. Dean Mendoza, are you still here? Oh yes, maybe you would like to answer this.
Yes, sure. I think the big concern is that we're going into the elections under pandemic conditions and under economic crisis conditions. So I don't believe we've ever faced such conditions before going into a major national election. So there is a big concern that the voting public will be very vulnerable. There will be the risk of politicized ayuda and social protection, as well as intensive vote buying. So these are some of the major concerns that relate not just to the structure of inequality in the country. We already had that before the pandemic, but also because of the special circumstances of the May 2022 elections. So it's important that we work together to try and counteract that. And sorry, may I add, I just want to commend the presentation by Ms. Suzara earlier, that it's very, very important that we protect the social protection policies of the government, because it's important that support not be politicized. And if that's going to be possible, then we stand a better chance at more informed, independent voting pattern in May 2022.
Thank you for that. So my last question is addressed to all speakers. If there was one thing you'd want the participants to take away from this panel discussion, what would it be? And perhaps we can start with Dr. Hara.
What the participants would like to
take away from the discussion.
We know that the citizenry, we can bind together. We really have, this coming election, we really have to choose the correct candidate, and we have to really rally for what is good for our country. We know we have several problems at hand, and we have to be united. That's it.
Thank you for that quick takeaway. Ms. Suzara?
Yeah, if I may, just two things that I'd like the audience to take away from my discussion, particularly on the national budget. First is that this is a critical budget. We've already missed the opportunity to provide massive aid and boost the public health system when the government did not prioritize those two things in the 2021 national budget. The 2022 national budget is very critical. We cannot wait for the 2023 national budget to correct the budget priorities. So what that entails is participation and engagement in the budget process. There's still going to be a BICAM sometime in December, and we really should demand for these budget priorities to get into the 2022 national budget. The second is because elections, the 2022 elections is around the corner, the budget needs to be a political and an election issue. We should be asking candidates what they intend to do for economic recovery and how they intend to translate those things into very specific programs, activities, and projects in the budget. Essentially, the policy and the governance agenda that these candidates, especially the presidential candidates, will be talking about needs to be followed by a question about what they intend to do in the budget, because if it's not in the budget, it will never be implemented. And if programs and projects towards an inclusive recovery are not funded in the budget, we will never have a chance to actually meaningfully recover from this pandemic, and more so do it in an inclusive way as it should be, as it should have been done in the 2021 national budget.
Thank you for that, Ms. Suzara. Dean Mendoza, your quick takeaway.
Yes, thank you. First, I want to end by thanking.
I think you're on mute, Dean Mendoza.
Sorry about that. I said first I want to thank the organizers for the kind invitation to join you again. I've been joining these events for the past, I guess, 4 years or so, or even longer. And we in the Blue Side are happy to support ADRI and our good friends in ADRI, Dindo, Christina, Paco, on this very, very important event that they host every year. My very simple message from my presentation is that I hope that this decade will be about governance, good governance, which was our main topic for today, but also about reclaiming the development narrative for the country, which is, I believe, part of the reason why populists basically take power is because we have lost the development narrative. So we gravitate towards any number of policy messages that don't necessarily bring us together in a common sort of narrative of development, inclusive development for the country. And that relates to the budget, that relates to the governance of the healthcare system, and that relates to citizen empowerment, as my good friend Kiko was outlining earlier, and of course the other presenter on the healthcare sector. So it all needs to sort of coalesce into a narrative that is cohesive. And if you don't have that, then you have any number of sort of interventions that don't really cling together, nor animate the voting public, our people, into a common vision of where we want to go as a country. And my humble contribution to this, and this is not even just mine, I'm in the presence of really deep thinkers, Kiko, Dindo, Dinjulai, many others who have been working on these topics. I only had the benefit of integrating some of the ideas in my presentation, but I believe it is inequality reduction that we really need to deeply think about. And inequality is not just economic. I'm an economist, so I can talk about the economic part of it, but I really believe the political and the social aspects of inequality, social being the social protection, social safety nets, the healthcare sector. If you don't believe you will be taken care of by your country, then why would you believe that you are part of the development plan? No, pagka nagkasakit ka, hindi ka naman kasama, hindi ka aalagaan, why would you necessarily believe in the democratic sort of project? This is how we lose people to populists, I think. And so I hope that is my main message that comes across, and I hope this decade will be about inequality reduction in our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Mendoza. Dr. Magno, your quick takeaway, please.
Yeah, I think our voters should look at candidates in terms of their track record and their commitment to democratic governance. Public participation has a very great value proposition in terms of promoting transparency and accountability. So it's very important to choose wisely. We need leaders who are who really believe in collaboration, in the value of citizen participation, and really institutionalizing a democratic ecosystem where you have freedom of expression, independent media, and the belief in an independent opposition. Whoever wins, there should be an opposition because the value of our development programs would be much better if there are options. And for these options to be really be meaningful, we also need to build our institutions for reviewing programs. We need data analytics. We need policy think tanks, and that contributes to having a deeper public engagement in our democratic process. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And that concludes our first panel for today. We'll proceed away to our second panel. And the second part of this program continues the conversation on public engagement. We will see the role the youth plays in a country's democracy and why the stakes are high for democracy in 2022. Let me introduce our first panelist for today, who will talk about the role of youth in the Philippine democracy. Party for Youth-Led Philippines. She has managed and organized 40 international development leaders. The floor is yours, Ms. Jorge.
Good morning and congratulations, Strat-Based ADR Institute, for the very successful Pilipinas conference this week. And thank you for giving us the opportunity to share some of our insights on the role of youth in Philippine democracy. In this presentation, we will share some insights that we have gained through our work with the youth. Youth Leadership for Democracy is a 5-year program jointly implemented by USAID and the Asia Foundation and focuses on increasing youth agency through leadership development, coalition building, and the institutionalization of civic education. The Philippines has deepened its democratic backsliding through the crackdown on free media, the curtailing of freedom of expression, the militarization of the pandemic response, executive overreach, and weakening checks and balances. These varied assaults on democratic freedom has intensified demands for political reform, leading to vocal pro-democratic responses as we have seen from youth and civil society. Vulnerabilities that have been identified in the Global State of Democracy report include the use of social media and other digital platforms for disinformation to discredit political opponents. Politics of othering, which creates polarized qualities of the self and others, has also emerged as a challenge and increases in closed environments such as social media echo chambers. It plays to the prejudices and anxieties within large sections of the population. This promotes threat and vulnerability among society. Participatory engagement has been identified as the biggest hope against democratic backsliding. Civil society participation, electoral participation, and direct democracy. It is necessary to ensure that democratic channels of communication and accountability are renewed, scaled up, and institutionalized. We also need to show how and why democratic governance is still the best option, most especially for our youth as they navigate through these challenges. Youth political and civic participation has played a large role in the vibrant history of Philippine democracy. From the first quarter storm in the 1970s, from which emerged a coalition of youth networks and organizations fighting a dictatorship, to the more recent student led protests against extrajudicial killings and media freedom, the youth has always been a force to reckon with. Young Filipinos are in a better position now to stake their claim to the Philippines' political landscape. Youth represent 30% of the Philippine population, where 52% of voters for the 2022 elections will fall below the age of 35. There is tremendous potential for youth to significantly influence democratic governance in the Philippines, with young people demonstrating grounded knowledge on issues affecting the country. However, to be able to defend democracy and invest in positive change, youth must feel that voting and political participation are worthwhile. While the youth have been willing to voice their opinions, these are efforts supported by institutions that value democracy and the freedom to express this. The challenge is that not all young people are afforded the support structure or the platforms to create or share their voices responsibly. This is part of the work that we are doing in Youth Led by providing the platforms and the capacity building for youth voices to be heard. In a nationwide survey we conducted with SWS earlier this year, with respondents coming from across all regions, we found that a large majority of today's generation of Filipino youth feel pride in being a Filipino. 81% feel very proud, and 60% feel quite proud, compared to only 69% of youth who felt very proud in 1996. This is true across all areas, regions, and social demographics. For youth and Philippine democracy, 70% of Filipino youth are satisfied with the way democracy works in the country. This is higher compared to 55% satisfaction from youth in 1996. Satisfaction is highest in Mindanao at 84%, followed by Visayas at 72% and Luzon at 56%. Comparing across some regions, we note that youth in Region 11 at 96% have a higher satisfaction than youth in Region 5 at 53%. When we compare youth in select cities, youth in Davao registered a 97% satisfaction rating. Youth in Quezon City are at 56%. Youth in Lawag have a 77% satisfaction rating. All 5 cities surveyed in NCR showed low satisfaction ratings for democracy. Manila at 40%, Pasig at 54%, Quezon City youth at 56%, Caloocan youth at 60%, and Pasig youth at 51%. For overall satisfaction on the way democracy works in the country, we broke this down further by social demographics, age, and education, as shown in this slide. For minority groups, the LGBT had the lowest satisfaction rating at 67% compared to indigenous peoples or persons with disabilities. On the opinion on the state of democracy in the Philippines, 11% of Filipino youth say that the Philippines has a full democracy. 54% say a democracy but with minor problems. 29% say a democracy with major problems. And only 5% say that the Philippines is not a democracy. We also asked the youth what they think are the most essential characteristics of a democracy. This was measured using 4 sets of statements based on the Asian Barometer survey. For each set, The respondents were asked to select the most essential characteristic out of 4 choices that correspond to good governance, social equality, norms and procedure, and freedom and liberty. The results of the survey indicate that on the average, Filipino youth understand the meaning of democracy in terms of social equality at 33%, good governance at 25%, norms and procedures 22%, and freedom and liberty 19%. Youth Led will delve deeper into the meaning of democracy based on these parameters through FGDs, especially in areas that have resulted in high and low satisfaction ratings for democracy. We will also study existing democratic and political structures vis-a-vis the results of the satisfaction ratings. These results can be further broken down by area and by social demographic profile. We presented the youth with 14 statements to determine the degree of agreement to assess knowledge and civil rights and responsibilities. These are 7 examples of the statements. Majority of youth agree at 93% that each citizen's rights to express their views in public should be protected. But only 57% agree that they are confident in expressing their own political opinions. It tells us areas to focus on with regards to civic rights and accountability. This will also aid in determining the right platforms that will enable the youth to have more confidence in making their voices heard, as well as the capacity to accomplish this. Our survey also presented the respondents with 16 individual and collective civil and political actions. Actions that they have done, haven't done but might do in the future, haven't done and would never do. The results shown here reflect individual civil and political actions, many of them online. Opportunities presented by online engagement allow for innovative and creative contributions from the youth, but we reiterate the support and guidance needed for discernment and civic-minded participation. Of importance to note are results that show activities that the youth identified they have not done and would not do regardless of the situation. Top activities are identified here, some of which represent general political activities, such as taking part in a political demonstration or a strike, 85%, joining or volunteering for a political party, 61%, joining a civil society organization, 50%. We also take note that across all areas, youth or student organizations at 45% is still the top group or organization that youth participate in, which is still the main entry point for youth on civic and political engagement. We are encouraged to note that when presented with issue-based advocacies rather than general modes of collective political participation, such as joining a political party, Filipino youth were more likely to take action. Survey results tell us that the youth are more likely to take collective action on poverty at 58%, violence against women and children 57%, lack of access to quality education 54%, climate change at 51%, and the response to the COVID-19 crisis at 49%. We also presented the youth with national issues, and the youth expressed varied levels of satisfaction and dissatisfaction on how the national administration was dealing with these issues. For example, 72% were dissatisfied with national administration's response to rising costs of goods or inflation. 66% were dissatisfied with national administration's response to corruption. 57% were dissatisfied with the lack of access to justice. 61% were dissatisfied with how the national administration was dealing with human rights violations. When we asked the youth where their main source of information about their responsibilities as a Filipino citizen, such as voting, paying taxes, and following the law, is from, they cite the home at 24%, followed by traditional mass media at 20%, high school at 17%, social media at 16%. This data shows the strong influence of the home in building the foundation for civic education. This is also evident in the results for the highest influencer for the youth in political decision making, which we will show in the next slide. This is aligned with youth-led civic education program, which also follows a non-academic strand for supporting civic education in communities and the home. We asked the youth who the biggest influencer for their vote is. The results show that the greatest influence in Filipino youth's decision on whom to vote for in the national level is the endorsement of one's family at 54%. These findings remain consistent across all age groups and social demographic status. Similar with the decision on whom to vote for, youth also look to family at 59% on their stance on political issues and look to their family as a guide at 57% on their support for government policies and activities. These results highlight and give focus to the family as the main political influencer for Filipino youth. This can serve as a guide for civic education and voter education entry points, looking to the family as political units, community and family-focused advocacy campaigns, and civic education for parents and communities. We also see the youth as becoming political influencers in their families and their communities. So some key takeaways from these initial batch of slides. As evidenced by the survey, young Filipinos are more inclined towards individual civic political action online and issue-based collective action. There is less interest in politics, but more focus on social issues and social change. By allowing the generation of young Filipinos to organize, express themselves this way, we pave the way for stronger democratic engagement. The upcoming presidential election in 2022 provides an opportunity to activate, organize, educate, and encourage participation through dialogues, debates, and the contribution to a youth policy and agenda. While we celebrate the aspirations, independence, and creativity of the youth, we also recognize their vulnerabilities and the barriers that make it difficult for them to achieve their dreams. This generation of youth has the passion, the power, and the capacity to protect democracy. But there is a need for interventions and platforms for democratic engagement that can lead to social and economic freedoms where the youth can be more energized, capacitated, and empowered to reach their goals. Thank you very much for your time and for listening to this presentation. We look forward to working with all of you to empower the Filipino youth.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Ms. Ching. We really appreciate it. I in particular appreciated most the data that you shared on what shapes the opinion of us, the youth vote, the Filipino youth vote. And I look forward to questions related to that later on in the open forum. Just to inform everybody, this is not one of those Freaky Friday situations. I am where I am actually Paco Pangalangan, the Executive Director of Strat-Based ADR Institute, and I'm pinch hitting for Attorney Jen, who kind of dropped out due to signal issues. That also means I have the pleasure of introducing our next panelist for this morning's event, and he's none other than Dr. July Tehanki. Dr. Tehanki is a full professor of political science and international studies and former dean of the College of Liberal Arts at the De La Salle University. He specializes in the comparative analysis of politics and development in East and Southeast Asia, and has extensive writing on elections, party politics, and political dynasties. Dr. Tahanki, good morning. The
Good
virtual
morning,
floor is
Paco.
yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Paco. First of all, I would like to thank Strat-based Albert Del Rosario Institute, most especially my good friend and colleague, Dindo Manhit, for inviting me to give my thoughts on the democratic challenges facing the country in the lead up to 2022 election. My presentation is based on a chapter I recently wrote for a book marking the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Martial Law, to be published by the Ateneo de Manila University Press in 2022. An abridged version of the chapter is currently running in Rappler, so please, you may access the short version, three-part version of the chapter, and the full version of the chapter will soon be released as a working paper by the La Salle Institute of Governance. Now, aside from the elections, 2022 will also mark the 50th anniversary of the declaration of martial law by the late dictator Ferdinand Marcos. Sadly, there seems to be a wave of authoritarian nostalgia sweeping the country today. And it would be the height of historical irony that on the 50th anniversary of the declaration of martial law, there is a possibility that another Marcos might reside in Malacanang. For scholars who have studied democratization, one of the puzzling outcomes in most countries that underwent democratic transitions is the return to power of parties and personalities who have deep roots in the dictatorship. It is confounding to note that after gaining the right to pick their leaders in free and fair elections, people would still vote for candidates identified with the authoritarian regime. The declaration of Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr., son of the former and ousted dictator, that he would seek the presidency in the 2022 national elections was not surprising to most observers. Insistent historical revisionism and persistent social media propaganda over 3 decades of a campaign for the family's political rehabilitation had been preparing for a capstone return to the presidential palace. What was surprising was the openness of a faction of the Partido Demokratikong Pilipino Lakas ng Bayan or PDP Laban and the Lakas Christian Muslim Democrats to support the dictator's son. Both PDP Laban and Lakas CMD have roots in the anti-Marcos struggle in the 1986 EDSA People Power Revolution. Now, rarely does transition to democracy abolish all vestiges of the preceding dictatorship. Following transitions, there are remnants of the previous regime that may persist in new or a variety of ways. While democratization is frequently portrayed as a Big Bang moment in which one regime collapses and is immediately replaced by another, the reality is those remnants of the previous regime nearly always persist in the next. For political scientist James Loxton, almost never does democratization produce a clean slate. Now, scholars have studied various forms of authoritarian vestiges or remnants that survive in democratic transitions. Two have been prominent in the literature. The first is the so-called emergence of authoritarian successor parties. And the second is the phenomena of authoritarian diaspora or dispersion. As my humble contribution to the literature, I also introduced another variant that seems to be evident in the Philippine case: the rise of authoritarian contamination, which refers to personalities closely identified with fallen authoritarians, infecting or contaminating democratic parties or parties that have struggled against authoritarianism or were founded in the aftermath of authoritarianism to consolidate democracy. Authoritarian successor parties operate after the democratic transition. They may begin as authoritarian ruling parties, but upon transition into the democratic regime, they become what is known as authoritarian successor parties. Now, successor parties may emerge from authoritarian parties in two ways. The first is that they are former ruling parties that continue to exist as authoritarian successor parties. Examples of these types of parties are to be found in Asia. No? For example, the Kuomintang Party of Taiwan, the Democratic Justice Party of South Korea, and Golkar of Indonesia. In the Philippines, the Kilusang Bagong Lipunan was the authoritarian party which in the transition transformed itself into an authoritarian successor party. Second, authoritarian successor parties may be created in reaction to democratic transitions by former personalities associated with the authoritarian regime. These personalities may create new parties to reposition themselves in the political market, often distancing themselves from the dictatorship to which they were beholden. Personalities formerly identified with fallen dictatorships do not survive only by forming authoritarian successor parties. They also migrate or disperse across multiple parties and electoral vehicles. Authoritarian diaspora refers to a pattern of dispersion among former authoritarian officials, which we may call the authoritarian cohort, in the lead up to or the aftermath of a transition to competitive elections. Buehler and Natamaja, two political scientists, recently tracked and counted the survival and defection rates of authoritarian cohorts in both the Philippines and Indonesia. For the Philippines, they found out that the overall KBL members who were last elected in 1985 in the regular Batasan Pambansa election managed to come back and return after the EDSA People Power Revolution. And the overall KBL members who won seat in the national legislature, either under the KBL or another party label, was quite significant, even after several electoral cycles. Now, this is in contrast with the Indonesian case, in which the mass migration of those identified with the Suharto dictatorship, members of Golkar, migrated to other parties only immediately after the transition to democracy. But in the case of the Philippines, as we can see in this chart, this table from Buehler and Natamaja, up to now, we can see the same authoritarian cohort who were once leaders and members of the former authoritarian party, KBL, being active in most of our political parties in the post-Marcos, post-EDSA period. Now, authoritarian dispersion or migration was made easier by the common Filipino practice of party switching. In 2019, I conducted with Yuko Kasuya of Keio University, Japan, a study, and we observed that the incidence of party switching in the House of Representatives from the 8th to the 17th Congress between 1987 and 2019, and an average of 32% of district representatives elected to the House shifted or changed their party affiliation more than once. So that's 32%. So no wonder it is so easy for the Marcos dynasty to return, to come back, because their former allies and their former cohorts are already well entrenched in the post-EDSA political party system. Now, I introduce another term, authoritarian contamination. And to my mind, authoritarian contamination is a potent variant of the authoritarian diaspora, since it does not only infect political parties, but it infected democratic parties that struggled against authoritarianism or were founded in the aftermath to consolidate democratic gains. Now, this type of infection serves to weaken democratic norms and values within our political system, which is already heavily compromised by dynasticism, patronage, and clientelism. Now, let us look at the various successor parties and contaminated parties in the current political landscape. As I said, as I already discussed, KBL was the authoritarian party organized by Marcos to consolidate his dictatorship in 1978 by recruiting members from both the Nacionalista and Liberal parties. After EDSA, its leaders and members dispersed into other parties, and the KBL became a weakened authoritarian successor party. However, it was the vehicle of the Marcos dynasty to rebuild their local bases in Ilocos and Leyte. Several former leaders of the KBL attempted to revive the Nacionalista Party after EDSA. But the franchise eventually went to then Vice President Salvador Laurel, a former KBL member himself, until he turned against Marcos. Now, the Marcos family has a long identification with the NP. Marcos won the presidency in 1965 under the NP. Bongbong Marcos won as senator in 2010, and Jaime Marcos in 2019 under the NP. And Bongbong failed his vice presidential run under the NP. Now let us look at the other parties that were contaminated. The PDP Laban was a merger of two staunchly anti-Marcos political parties in 1983. Laban, or Lakas ng Bayan, was founded by the slain anti-Marcos leader Benigno Ninoy Aquino Jr. And of course, Partido Demokratiko Pilipino was founded in 1982 by another staunch anti-Marcos leader, the late Aquilino Nene Pimentel Jr. It was the party of Cory Aquino in 1986, but after EDSA, it gradually transformed into a party that supported populists, from Fernando Poe Jr. to Jeju Marbinay, and then eventually to Rodrigo Duterte. The LDP was carved out of the PDP Laban by relatives of President Cory Aquino to form her own KBL. And it recruited a large number of former KBL members. Lakas CMD was formed in the spirit of the 1986 EDSA People Power Revolution that ousted the Marcos dictatorship. It was a merger of the Lakas ng EDSA party founded by former Defense Secretary Fidel Ramos and the National Union of Christian Democrats founded by former Senator and another anti-Marcos leader, Raul Manglapus. Lakas CMD supported Bongbong Marcos's failed vice presidential run in 2016 and has endorsed his presidential bid in 2020. We can also identify a new batch of authoritarian successor parties that were spawned under the Duterte administration. And I call them the neo-authoritarian successor parties. We have the Ugpong ng Pagbabago, which was the regional counterpart of the Duterte local party, Ugpong sa Taong Lungsod. And of course, HNP is identified with Mayor Sara Duterte. Then you have the Partido Federal ng Pilipinas and the Federalismo ng Dugong Dakilang Sambayanan or PDBS, which were originally satellite parties of the PDP Laban, organized to support Duterte's push for federalism. PDDS is identified with the allies of Senator Bongo. The Katipunan ng Demokratikong Pilipino is a party organized by Duterte's ultra-right supporters, and is fielding the former red-tagging General Antonio Parlade Jr. for president in 2020. So, the inability to adequately address legacies of authoritarianism, 3 decades since the ouster of the Marcos dictatorship, has impacted the overall consolidation of the country's democratic gains and continues to weaken its electoral and party system. The rise of an authoritarian populist like Rodrigo Duterte was a symptom, not the cause, of this democratic erosion. The possible return of a Marcos to the presidential palace would be symptomatic of this infection. If Philippine democracy has gradually infected by authoritarian contamination, I think the appropriate response would be democratic vaccination. For decades, reform advocates have pushed for new rules to address the country's weak political institutions. Time and time again, our colleagues in this webinar have shouted, no? And we're beginning to sound like broken records. No? Institutions matter. No? The intransigent hold of political dynasties to power, the constant party switching, and deep dependence on patronage politics to get things done have severely weakened the health of the country's electoral democracy. The law enabling constitutional ban on political dynasties has not been passed by Congress 3 decades since its inception. The Political Party Development Act has been languishing in Congress since 2003. Similarly, the Freedom of Information Bill has languished for over 2 decades. So, these measures should be among the top priorities for the democratic forces as we march towards reclaiming democracy and fighting for the return of full democracy in this country in next year's election. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tihanki, for that illuminating presentation on how democracy can easily backslide into authoritarianism. Now we will open the floor to questions. We do have 2 questions from the audience. The first is from youth advocates for the Philippines. They ask, what should be the best thing that we can do for the upcoming election? What should we consider as the youth? Anybody from the 2 speakers would like to answer this question? Maybe Ms. Jorge?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for that question. First, we have a number of activities that young people can participate in, especially for the elections. But most easily, we have toolkits available on our website that you can share to your families, friends, and communities. This is a whole, it contains our voter education module and some collaterals that can be downloaded and shared as well. But most importantly, I think is to be able for young people to be able to assess candidates based on their capabilities and the issues that they stand for. And that's why we are very encouraged with how young people today are very aware of the issues that they feel very passionately about. So let's translate this to how we assess and study the candidates that we have, not just for national level, but for local level as well. So are these issues aligned with what is needed by the country? Do they have a vision for your locality or for the country? So are we assured of their commitment? So those materials are available, and we have this free and downloadable for all of our youth leaders, organizations, and advocates.
Thank you very much for that, Ms. Jorge. Our next question, I think Dr. Tihanki can answer. Is there time to change the minds of the decided voters leaning towards dubious candidates? Are they truly decided? This is from the audience.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Thank you for that question. It's still early in the game. No, a lot can still happen. No, we are just in the first act of a 3-act play. No, and we have just seen the drama at the starting line. No, and eventually, the process of winnowing out will happen during the campaign proper, as candidates respond to issues and as they present their platform to the electorate. No? And of course, if most political strategies would look at the electoral support for candidates, and it's usually classified as either hard, medium, or soft. No? And of course, what we are seeing now in the current rankings, in the surveys are simply snapshots that can change in due course. No? So, but of course, it all depends on us. No? Those who would want to make an impact on the outcome of next year's election and prevent further regression and backsliding into authoritarianism. No? And this can be done, if we go out of our respective echo chambers. No? The real struggle is outside the social media and internet. No? So it will take a lot of hard work from all concerned citizens to not talk down on the voters, not to look down on the poor voters, but to try to understand and listen and address the concerns they have. And as we have heard from the previous speakers, it's the lack of development. It's the collective failure to reach the promised land of development and democracy.
Can I add? Can I just add?
Yes, sure.
Okay, so part of civic education is respecting the choices of our voters, no? And usually voters gravitate towards candidates who they feel will listen to them or they can approach. So I mean that's evident in the results of our national elections, right? But helping to educate by means of conversations, presenting alternative options, giving feedback based on fact, rather than personality driven opinions or politics, will be helpful in influencing voters' opinion and choices. So it's not really changing. I'm telling them who to vote for, because I don't think that's the approach that we should be giving, but rather, giving them options so that they can form their new opinions and choices. So thank you.
And if I may add also, no, that's why I'm very uncomfortable with the term voters education, no, because it's like you're blaming the voters, no, for the bad choices that we have, no. So I would prefer civic education or political education, because we don't need to educate simply the voters. We need to educate the politicians as well. So I think it's more civic education and more political education.
Correct. Yes.
Thank you. That is indeed a great point that both of you highlighted.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, we don't have any more time for questions, and I'd like to introduce the person who will deliver closing remarks for today's panel. To deliver today's closing remarks, we have Judge Raul Pangalangan. Judge Raul Pangalangan served as a judge at the International Criminal Court from 2015 to March 2021. He was the former dean of the University of the Philippines College of Law, where he taught constitutional law and public international law. The floor is yours, Judge Raul.
Hello, thank you so much to my former student, Jenny Domino, for the very kind introduction. As Jenny said, I was away for a while, for a number of years. And what struck me when I came back to Manila was that I found the discourse rather too polarized back home. And I was wondering how I could make sense of things and how I could take part in the debates. And that is why I really thank StratBase, Professor Dindo Manhit, for having organized this forum, for filling a gap in Philippine discourse, and for providing us this space for a sober reflection on Philippine events, for allowing us to discuss with sobriety and with clear reflection on our current situation. And of course, for gathering the wonderful speakers that we have heard this morning. I have followed the entire event from the opening by Dindo to the presentations of our colleagues, and I have found them most enlightening. They have provided us, first of all, we start with the facts, which is, I discovered in the Philippines, in itself a challenge to get hold of the facts on which we will make our choices, our decisions. But beyond that, the distinguished public intellectuals that Dindo has gathered have provided us the language, the concepts in which we will debate our future, on which we will make hard choices. I would like to close with the concept of the social critic, and here I am guided by the writings of a philosopher, Michael Walzer, who spoke about the detached critic on one hand, and on the other hand, the connected critic. The detached critic can very well be many of our speakers today. The way Walzer described it is that people, well, critics, by way of example, from the former colonies, who have been educated in the most prestigious learned institutions all over the world, who are well connected with that cosmopolitan circle of elite thinkers, and yet see their country, their society from a distance, almost as outsiders. And on the other, he identified the connected critic, bound up with his milieu. And he says it's almost like the foreign educated scholar remaining back home, returning back home to apply insights drawn from cosmopolitan elite discourse and bringing them to bear upon his circumstance, upon the native circumstance. And on that point, I congratulate Dindo and his team at Stratbase, the Albert Del Rosario Institute, and the distinguished public intellectuals whom he has gathered to help us find our way in this highly contentious political season in Manila. And I hope will help guide our country as we make difficult decisions in the next half year, leading toward May 2022. The insights that the speakers have shared with us this morning, I hope will find their way into public discourse, into social media, and help us shape the choices, the historic choices that we face in May 2022. Once again, my congratulations to Dindo, his team, to Stratbase, to Albert Del Rosario Institute, and to the wonderful team of intellectuals and theorists that Dindo has gathered. Have a good day.
Thank you so much, Judge Raul.
Professor Dindo Manhit, would you like to formally close the conference for all of us?
Yes, thank you, Attorney Jenny. Thank you to all our speakers this morning. Thank you, of course, to one of our Board of Trustees, Judge Raul Pangalangan, who has been with us since the start of the Stratbase ADR Institute. But I would focus and really say our grateful and thankful feeling towards, I think if I would estimate, over 3,500 participants spread across a 5-day session. And when you look at what we wanted to do in these 5-day sessions, looking at the economy, looking at the challenges brought about, the economic consequences, or the economic consequences brought about by this continuing health crisis, looking at the need for a green economic recovery. And of course, externally, will always be challenged by what is happening geopolitically, not only outside our borders, even in our own EEZ. How do we protect our own maritime rights, our territorial integrity? But at the core of this, is we are a democracy. We live in a democracy. A generation of Filipinos fought for this democracy. And democracy might not be perfect, but the democratic system is what should prevail in our country. But with it, the need for a more responsive governance, one that is centered or founded on the idea of transparency and accountability in governance. Rest assured to all those who participated in this conference, we in the Albert Rosario Institute, we in the Stratbase Group will continuously fight and push for reforms and ensure democratic governance in our country, a more open democracy. We will always take note of the need for environmental stewardship as one where a whole of society is needed. And also, there's no room for growth if it will not address the challenge of inequality, if it will not address a more inclusive economic recovery post-pandemic. Again, good noon to all, and thank you for this past 5 days. Thank you to all speakers, thank you to all participants, and of course, thank you to our team behind the scenes who have worked so hard for this Pilipinas conference. We will be sharing our recording. There will be publications from this conferences, like our special studies, which will be turned into an ebook by next year. So we can have, our desire is to contribute to a more substantive political discourse going into the 2022 national campaign. Thank you and have a good day.